Week 9 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 backs. I'm ranking this week number 1, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. The last 3 weeks, he's really turned the season around and putting up those elite numbers like you expect Robinson to put up, where he was drafted top 5, top 7 range in most fantasy drafts coming into the year. So this week, a great matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys. Their defense is banged up. They're stopping no one over the last few weeks. And like I said, Bijan Robinson's a dual threat in this offense. I believe this week he goes out there versus weak Cowboy defense. Has a great game. Number 2, Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Barkley's fit this offense like a glove. This offense is riding high right now over the last few weeks is Philadelphia, putting up a lot of points on the board since Brown and Devonta Smith returned to the lineup. And Saquon Barkley, he's a dual threat out of the backfield. This season, he's been a top 5 running back easily in fantasy football, and a great matchup this week versus the Jaguars. Number 3, Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. So Derrick Henry, best back in fantasy football, in my opinion, this season. And coming in, I didn't expect him to keep up these elite numbers, but he's definitely done it all so far this year. And a dynamic offense, obviously, with the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson on the center. This week, definitely a tougher matchup versus Denver, but he's a matchup-proof running back and always a top 1 to 5 option weekly for Kyren Williams of Los Angeles Rams. Kyren Williams, he's been great once again this season. Last year, he was a big-time league winner for fantasy owners. And this week, a good matchup with the Seattle Seahawks. We just saw James Cook go out there and light him up for over 100 yards and found the end zone twice in that ball game. So I know Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp are back in the lineup, but it just doesn't matter. This offense is dynamic, and it seems like all these guys go out there and put up their numbers. Number 5, Alvin Kamara of New Orleans Saints. Alvin Kamara, one of the best dual threats still in the league, and the Saints rewarded him with a 2-year extension. So this week, a great matchup at division rival, the Carolina Panthers. They can't stop anyone all season long, 1-7 on the year. And if this team could get a little bit healthy and possibly Derek Carr returning to the lineup, that just boosts up Kamara's value. Number 6, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. So this week, a potential shootout, and it's also a Thursday night game. You know, the points are put on the board early and often in those Thursday night games versus the Houston Texans. We know this Texan defense hasn't been all that great. Jonathan Taylor last week over 100 yards, found the end zone. And Breece Hall, I know yards per carry hasn't been great this year, but he's still one of the best receiving backs out of the backfield. Number 7, Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. So Joe Mixon, he's been a great running back this season. I know he had a hiccup in the early weeks of the year with the high ankle sprain, but he's returned and he's been an elite running back. So this week, I think they're going to lean on him a little bit more. Stephon Diggs out for the season, torn ACL. Nico Collins out another week, returning next week in week 10. And this Jet defense, they've been getting gashed on the ground as well. We saw Stevenson last week go for 23 fantasy points in PPR league. So with all those factors, I think Joe Mixon is in for another top 10 performance. Number 8, Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. Achane, he's been a superstar running back when Tua was in the lineup. And the 3 games Tua has been in the lineup this season, he's had 15 or more fantasy points in PPR league. So this week, a tougher matchup at Buffalo. But like I said, Achane's a dual threat out of the backfield, and even if they're trailing, is his Dolphin team. He's a good receiver as well. We saw him take a screen to the end zone last week. And Achane, as long as he's getting a healthy workload, even though I know Mostert's been obviously taking goal line touches, he's still going to put up numbers. Number 9, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. Cook last week, the monster game, over 100 yards, found the end zone twice. One of the best running backs in all pro football and fantasy football. This week, a pretty favorable matchup versus the Miami Dolphins, where their defense has been poor and banged up all season long. And this obviously could be a potential shootout between these two AFC East rivals. So I think James Cook once again has a good game. Number 10, Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. So Kenneth Walker last week, it was a down game, but it was a down game overall for Seattle, where Buffalo went into Seattle and they went up early and often in that game, and it was a lot of garbage time and just a bad performance overall. So if Metcalf returns to the lineup, it'll open up the running game a little bit more. And we know this Ram defense isn't all that great this season. Last week, we saw Aaron Jones have a nice ball game versus them, and I think Kenneth Walker will this week as well. Number 11, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. So the last 2 weeks, he's put up monster performances. Last week, broke a 70-yard touchdown. In that one is Jahmyr Gibbs. And on limited touches, obviously the 70-yard touchdown got him a lot of yards. He went over 100 yards in that ball game. So he's one of the more lethal running backs in the league, catching the football out of the backfield in between the tackle. Again, this week, definitely a tougher matchup at the Packers. But like I said, Jahmyr Gibbs is matchup proof and one of the best backs in the league. Number 12, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. So Taylor returned last week from injury with the high ankle sprain, and he went out there and had a nice ball game with the Texans, over 100 yards and a touchdown. This week, a tougher matchup with the Minnesota Vikings. They got a stiff defense for the most part, even though I know Kyren Williams last week had a good ball game versus them. But Jonathan Taylor, he was taken late first, early second round in most fantasy drafts. And when he plays, he's a good running back, no doubt about it. So hopefully he stays healthy now and keeps putting up numbers. 13, staying in the same game. Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings. Aaron Jones, he's a solid back, no doubt about it. Just injuries have done him in over the last couple seasons. And now on a one-year prove-it deal with Minnesota. He's had a great season. So this week, a good matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts, where their defense isn't all that great this year. We saw last week Joe Mixon run for a nice ball game, and I think Aaron Jones once again goes out there and has a good performance. 14, DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. So the first 3 weeks of the season, DeAndre Swift, he couldn't get anything going, averaging under 2.5 yards per carry. But the last 4 or 5 weeks now, he's gone out there and had monster performances, including last week going over 120 yards on the ground and finding the end zone. So this week in a potential shootout and a good matchup on paper at Arizona, I think Swift once again has a good ball game. 15, Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. So this week, a good matchup with the New York Giants for Brian Robinson. Last week, he looked pretty solid once again. And this Commander team 6-2, first in the NFC East this season. And Brian Robinson's been a big part of this team all season long. So this week, with a good matchup at the Giants, where Najee Harris looked good last week on the ground versus them, I think once again Robinson has a good ball game. The only downside for him, he's not much of a pass catcher out of the backfield over the last few weeks. 16, Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. So the workloads have been big ones for Josh Jacobs this season. A lot of 20, 25 rush attempt ball games. This week we'll see if Jordan Love plays. And in my opinion, I think he's going to play with a slight groin injury. And also it's a division matchup versus the first place Detroit Lions. So Josh Jacobs, on volume and workload alone, getting all these touches, he's going to work his way into a number 2 running back, worst case. 17, Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Hunt, he was on the couch a month and a half ago, and now he's been a solid running back over the last few weeks for this Kansas City Chief team, filling in for Isaiah Pacheco. We thought Carson Steele was going to be the back in the backfield for Kansas City, but the fumble issues got him benched. And now Kareem Hunt's taking advantage of the situation with the touches, and he's become one of the better backs in fantasy football over the last few weeks. So this week with a good matchup versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that can't stop anyone. I like Hunt as a top 20 option. 18, Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. Tony Pollard, it's been a good season for him in a bounce-back year in Tennessee, where last season when they struggle for the most part with the Dallas Cowboys. So this week, a good matchup versus the New England Patriots. We'll see if it's Mason Rudolph or Will Levis, a quarterback once again for this Tennessee Titan team. But Tony Pollard, in between the tackles, he's been solid, and a good pass catcher out of the backfield at times as well, where Tajay Spears, I thought coming into the year would be a split of some sort between these two backs, but it's been all Tony Pollard this year, and a good matchup versus the Patriots this week. 19, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So this Lion team is the best 2 combo in the backfield together. And Montgomery, we know, he's the goal line back and in between the tackles more than Jahmyr Gibbs. So David Montgomery's been solid all season long. This week, a tougher matchup at the Green Bay Packers, but I think Montgomery goes out there and once again has a solid performance. 20, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. James Conner's a solid running back. No one's been a threat all season long for him, and we know he's been a great back throughout his career. Just injuries have done him in over the last couple seasons. But this week, not the greatest of matchups versus the Chicago Bears, but James Conner can catch the football out of the backfield. Obviously getting a lot of touches, and he's going to work his way into volume, into some points. 21, J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers. This week, a middle-of-the-pack matchup at the Cleveland Browns. I thought the Browns did an okay job last week versus Derrick Henry. And at the dog pound, their defense has been better than it's been on the road, even though it's definitely taken a step back from last season. So this week, J.K. Dobbins going to get a full workload once again. I thought Kamimi Vidal will get more touches, but as long as Dobbins is healthy, he's a solid number 2 back for fantasy owners. Weekly, 22, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. So Chuba Hubbard, he was on fire from week 4 to week 6, but he's cooled off over the last few weeks, and there's a possibility we see Jonathan Brooks get some touches in this ball game. So Brooks, he was a second-round pick this year from the Carolina Panthers, and we know they've sold off some pieces now towards the NFL trade deadline. And Chuba Hubbard, though, he's been a good back for the majority of the season, but like I said, the numbers have dropped off just a bit the last few weeks, and it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus the Saints 23 Chase Brown, Cincinnati Bengals. So this week, a good matchup versus the Vegas Raiders. Their defense can't stop anyone. We saw Kareem Hunt last week go out there, have a big performance versus this defense. And this week, I think Chase Brown could bounce back. Last week, he only had a little over 2 yards per carry, but he did find the end zone. So with a good matchup and a good receiving back out of the backfield, I think Chase Brown puts in a good performance. 24, Ramondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. So this week, I think it's going to be tough sledding in this one, especially with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback for this New England Patriot team. I know last week he had a big game, 23 fantasy points in PPR leagues versus the New York Jets' Ramondre Stevenson. But it seems like every other week he has a good ball game, and the way it's gone for him this week, I don't expect much. And this Tennessee Titan defense, I think, is a decent unit. I know the last 2 weeks they got the doors blown off by Buffalo, and obviously last week 52 points to the Lions. But I think Stevenson this week, the ceiling isn't that high. 25, Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. He still has to get his legs under him as Nick Chubb. This week, not a great matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers, even though we saw Alvin Kamara last week have some success. But obviously, Chubb isn't 100%, and also he's not the receiving back out of the backfield, where he's not going to get numbers really catching the football. So in between the tackles, he's got to do his work. Jerome Ford possibly could return in this ball game for this Brown team, where he might get some carries and work on third down and passing downs. But I think Nick Chubb, as the weeks go on, will get stronger. But this week, he's a back-end two-option flex. 26, Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. One of the best receiving backs out of the backfield is Rachaad White. But Bucky Irvin's definitely eaten into the workload over the last 3-4 weeks of the season, where Rachaad White's been more of a third down and a receiving back, and Bucky Irvin in between the tackles has definitely been better yards per carry. So this week at Kansas City, it's going to be a bowl game. Most likely they're going to be trailing early and often. White's going to get more looks and targets, I believe, as well. Obviously, with Evans and Chris Godwin out, someone's going to have to catch the football. They got a lot of young guys, Trey Palmer, Chandler McMillan, and you got the veteran Sterling Shepard banged up as well. But like I said, he's going to get some work catching the football as Rachaad White. And even in a tough matchup, I think he's a decent flex. 27, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Etienne, we'll see if he returns this week. And I still believe the overall back for fantasy football, he's better than Tank Bigsby. Bigsby's had a couple opportunities. He had one big game. But besides that, we haven't seen much. This week, a matchup at Philadelphia where most likely they're going to be trailing early and often is this Jacksonville Jaguar team and have to throw the football. And with Christian Kirk out and Brian Thomas not 100%, Etienne, that's where he could step in and make some impact out of the backfield. 28, Alexander Mattison of the Vegas Raiders. So Madison, he's the back over there if you want to own one in Vegas. And this week, a pretty decent matchup with the Cincinnati Bengals. And Alexander Mattison, a decent receiver out of the backfield. In between the tackles, I know he's not showing much. But this Raider team, if they want to keep this game close and establish the run a little bit, I think Alexander Mattison is their best bet. And we've seen some decent games from Madison this season. So this week, in an okay matchup, I think he could be a back-end flex option. 29, Bucky Irvin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So I think the running lanes are going to be tough for Bucky Irvin in this one. Kansas City, like I said, one of the best defenses in the league. And now to go into Arrowhead, a tough environment as well, it's going to be tough for Bucky Irvin and this Buck team. And if they're trailing early and often, Rachaad White's the passing downs back, where Irvin's not much of a receiver so far this season, even though in college he was good catching the football out of the backfield. 30, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. So the way this game script could go, Javonte Williams might not do much in this one. I know he's caught some passes out of the backfield, but he's not really the third down back with Jaleel McLaughlin there for the Denver Broncos. So Javonte Williams, when his team's up and playing good football, obviously he puts up decent fantasy numbers. But a game like last week, even though where they were up early and often, he didn't do much out of the backfield. 31, Raheem Mostert of the Miami Dolphins. So Raheem Mostert, if he's not scoring touchdowns, the value's not going to be there for Mostert. So last week, 2 goal line stompers he had in that ball game. That salvaged his day, only 16 fantasy points because of those 2 touchdowns. And this week, a tougher matchup at Buffalo where they could be trailing in this one. And Devon Achane, obviously, then would be the all 3 down back for this Miami Dolphin team. So like I said, if he's not scoring touchdowns in the red zone, is Raheem Mostert. His value isn't that big. 32, Devin Singletary of the New York Giants. At Tracy, he put on some performance before he went down with a concussion. 20 carries, 145 yards, and he found the end zone last week versus the Steelers. So this week it looks like Singletary's going to start versus the Commanders. And Singletary, not much of a receiver out of the backfield this season. And in between the tackles, he hasn't been all that great as well, where Tracy had an opportunity and he took the job. But now we'll see if Singletary could possibly get more carries back, where he's going to be the running back in this one. 33 Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys last week. He missed the ball game with an illness. Should be back in this one in Atlanta. But this could be a game where I think Dallas is going to have trouble stopping Atlanta once again, and they're going to have to throw the football 40, 45 times in this one. Even though Dowdle's been a decent receiver out of the backfield this year, his ceiling isn't that high. And this week in Atlanta, the way the game possibly might go, I don't see Dowdle having much upside. 34, Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Chase Brown definitely vultured Moss over the last few weeks in the backfield, where Brown's a better receiver out of the backfield, more burst and home run hitting ability to find the end zone anywhere on the field. But Zach Moss, I still believe, is a solid running back. This week, it's a pretty good matchup versus the Vegas Raiders, where there's a possibility they might go back to that 50-50 split. But right now, it's a wait-and-see approach. 35, Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the way this game most likely will go, and if Travis Etienne's back, we know Bigsby's not much of a receiver at all out of the backfield. In between the tackles, he's a physical back, and he does have home run ability. No doubt about it, he's Tank Bigsby. But like I said, if they're trailing in Philadelphia early in that ball game and Etienne's playing, it's going to be an issue for Bigsby really to have fantasy value and put up points. In the 36th and final backup rankings, Tyler Algier of the Atlanta Falcons, one of the best handcuff running backs in all pro football. This week, a good matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys that can't stop the run at all. And Tyler Algier, we've seen some games this season where he's had 12, 15 touches, including a game where he's had over 100 yards in a ball game with Tyler Algier. So this week versus the Dallas Cowboys, I think we might see some opportunities from Algier in this one. So this week with a pretty decent matchup, even though he's a backup running back, is Tyler Algier. I think he still could see some time and put up surprising numbers. So that's a top 36 running backs I'm ranking for week 9 of the fantasy football season.